At the glittering Manhattan charity gala, Daniel Brooks raised a champagne glass beside his runway model fiancée Vanessa, smiling as he joked about the ordinary ex-wife he left behind. Then the ballroom doors opened. Emily Carter stepped in, emerald silk, her pregnancy unmistakable, whispers spreading across the room. Daniel laughed until a tall stranger followed. Alexander Pierce, the billionaire jet tycoon whose aircraft empire Daniel's company depended on, the host suddenly announced Alexander as the night's main investor. Silence fell as Alexander gently touched Emily's belly. Daniel realized everything he built could vanish with one decision, and Emily was only just beginning tonight. Funny thing about the past, Daniel Brooks liked to say with a polished smile, it only has power if you let it follow you. The ballroom of the Hudson Crown Hotel glittered like a jewelry case under the massive crystal chandeliers, their lights spilling across marble floors and perfectly tailored tuxedos as the city's most ambitious executives and investors gathered for the Skyline Aviation Charity Gala, the kind of event where reputations were built, partnerships quietly negotiated, and fortunes casually compared over glasses of 12-year single malt. Daniel stood near the center of the room like a man who believed the night belonged to him, one hand loosely wrapped around a glass of champagne, the other resting confidently at the waist of his fiancée Vanessa Hart, a runway model whose presence drew curious glances from nearly every corner of the ballroom. Cameras from a few lifestyle magazines flashed occasionally, capturing the couple in flattering angles that would appear online by morning. Vanessa's silver evening gown shimmered beneath the chandelier light like liquid mercury, and Daniel clearly enjoyed the attention it brought. He leaned closer to a circle of colleagues, his voice smooth and casual, telling a story that had become one of his favorites over the past year. Some people, he said lightly, swirling the pale gold champagne in his glass, just aren't built for the kind of life we live. The group chuckled politely, understanding exactly who he meant without needing to hear her name. Emily Carter had once stood beside him at events like this, quieter, less dazzling, the woman who used to believe that love could grow stronger than ambition. Daniel had left that chapter behind months ago, and tonight he was making sure everyone knew it. Vanessa smiled sweetly beside him, her hand resting on his arm like a living trophy, the perfect symbol of the upgraded life Daniel Brooks had crafted for himself. Across the ballroom, a jazz trio played softly, the gentle rhythm blending with the hum of conversation and the faint scent of expensive cologne and polished wood. Everything about the evening felt calculated, refined, controlled. Daniel loved control. He lifted his glass again, enjoying the attention of the small audience around him, when suddenly the towering double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened with a quiet sweep. At first no one paid much attention. Guests arrived late to galas all the time. But a subtle ripple moved through the room as the woman who stepped inside paused beneath the golden light of the entrance. Her emerald dress caught the chandelier glow in deep green reflections, elegant but understated, and for a moment Daniel didn't even recognize her. Then the whispers began. Heads turned. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Someone softly murmured a name. Emily Carter walked slowly across the marble floor, calm and composed, one hand resting gently over the small curve of her pregnancy that the dress could no longer hide. Daniel felt the familiar confidence in his chest falter for the first time that evening. He hadn't seen Emily in 8 months. He had assumed, like many people in the room, that she had quietly disappeared from the world he now ruled. He gave a short, amused laugh under his breath, leaning toward his friends as if the moment were nothing more than a strange coincidence. Well, he muttered lightly, lifting his glass again. Looks like the past decided to show up anyway. But just as Emily reached the center of the ballroom, another figure stepped through the entrance behind her, tall, composed, unmistakably commanding the room without saying a single word. And in that instant, the quiet murmur spreading through the gala changed into something very different. The whisper that moved through the ballroom spread like a slow ripple across still water as Emily Carter continued walking across the polished marble floor, her pace steady and unhurried, the emerald fabric of her dress catching the chandelier light with every step, while the soft music from the jazz trio faltered, as if even the musicians sensed something unusual unfolding in the center of the Skyline Aviation Charity Gala. And Daniel Brooks felt an unfamiliar tension tighten. in his chest as he watched the woman he had not seen in 8 months calmly cross a room filled with the very people who had once witnessed their marriage dissolve into quiet scandal. And for a brief moment the confident story he had been telling his colleagues about the past seemed to lose its shine as memories returned without invitation. Memories of a different Emily who once stood beside him at events like this, wearing simpler dresses and offering quieter smiles. A woman who had believed in his dreams before they were impressive enough to attract investors or magazine photographers. Yet the woman approaching now did not look like someone who had been erased by that past. She looked composed, dignified, almost serene, her hand resting gently against the subtle curve of her pregnancy, as if protecting something far more important than the opinions of the room. And Daniel forced himself to laugh softly under his breath, while a few guests nearby leaned toward one another in hushed curiosity. Vanessa Hart remained beside him, though her posture stiffened slightly as she followed the direction of everyone's attention, and Daniel lifted his glass again, as if the moment were nothing more than a passing curiosity. Yet the whispering continued to grow, and then the tall figure who had entered behind Emily stepped farther into the golden light of the ballroom entrance. His dark tailored suit cut with the effortless precision of someone accustomed to quiet power rather than showmanship, his expression calm and observant as his gaze followed Emily across the room without urgency or concern for the attention gathering around them. And several guests near the back suddenly recognized him at the same time, which only deepened the murmur spreading through the crowd. Because Alexander Pierce was not a man who attended social events casually. His name carried the weight of private aviation empires and global transport networks, the kind of influence that reshaped industries and quietly determined which companies would rise and which would disappear. And as he moved forward through the doorway, the gala host standing near the stage stiffened in visible surprise before quickly adjusting his tuxedo jacket, as though preparing to welcome a far more significant guest than the evening schedule had promised. Daniel felt the small circle of colleagues around him fall silent as realization slowly dawned in their expressions, because everyone in the aviation business knew exactly who Alexander Pierce was, and Daniel's company had spent the past 2 years negotiating contracts that depended on access to aircraft infrastructure controlled by Pierce's global fleet, a fact Daniel had always treated as distant corporate strategy rather than personal reality. Yet now the reality was walking calmly across the ballroom floor toward the same woman Daniel had just dismissed as a forgotten chapter of his life, and Emily finally stopped near the center of the room where the golden chandelier light softened against her shoulders while the quiet tension in the crowd grew almost tangible, and Alexander Pierce stepped to her side with the calm assurance of someone who did not need to announce himself because the room already understood his presence. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Brooks lowered his champagne glass slowly as the comfortable confidence he had worn all night began to crack beneath a question he had never considered before, because the past he believed he had left behind was no longer standing alone. For several long seconds the ballroom remained suspended in a strange and fragile silence as Alexander Pierce came to stand beside Emily Carter beneath the warm cascade of chandelier light, his presence calm but unmistakably powerful in a way that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. And the quiet shift in the atmosphere was immediate because everyone in the aviation and investment world understood what it meant when Alexander Pierce appeared somewhere unannounced, especially at a charity gala built around an industry his companies quietly influenced across continents. And Daniel Brooks felt the small circle of executives around him slowly lean back, as though giving the moment more space. Their earlier laughter now replaced with careful observation as the story Daniel had been telling only minutes ago suddenly sounded far less impressive in the new context unfolding before them. Vanessa Hart glanced up at him with a faint crease of confusion across her expression while the gala host near the stage hurried forward with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, adjusting his microphone as he spoke with the kind of respectful enthusiasm reserved for extremely rare guests, welcoming Alexander Pierce to the evening and thanking him for supporting the Skyline Aviation Foundation. And the announcement alone caused another wave of murmurs across the ballroom because everyone understood the significance of that name attached to any event connected to aviation investment. Yet Alexander simply nodded politely before resting his attention back on Emily, who stood quietly beside him with the same composed calm she had carried since entering the room, and Daniel could not ignore the way Alexander's posture naturally placed him slightly closer to her, as though she belonged within his orbit rather than as an unexpected visitor. And Daniel felt the slow tightening of realization inside his chest as small details began connecting in ways he had never considered before. The subtle curve of Emily's pregnancy, the quiet confidence in her expression, the fact that she had not once looked toward him with anger or regret, only with the distant composure of someone who had already moved beyond the past he believed still defined her. And when Emily finally turned her head slightly toward Alexander, the exchange between them was simple but unmistakable, a quiet familiarity that suggested shared trust rather than coincidence. And Daniel lowered his champagne glass completely now as a few executives behind him began whispering quietly about Pierce's global fleet and the massive private aviation contracts scheduled for negotiation later that year. Contracts Daniel's own company had been working toward securing for months. And the sudden possibility that those negotiations were no longer distant corporate discussions, but something connected to the woman standing across the ballroom floor unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss. Because for the first time the power balance inside that elegant room had shifted without a single dramatic word being spoken, and as Alexander gently placed a reassuring hand near the small of Emily's back, while the host continued speaking about upcoming partnerships and investment opportunities, Daniel Brooks understood something that none of his earlier confidence had prepared him for. The woman he once described as too ordinary for his world had returned not to revisit the past, but to reveal a future that was already far beyond it. The music in the ballroom slowly returned as the jazz trio resumed their soft rhythm. Yet the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be undone because the attention of the entire room now hovered quietly around Emily Carter and Alexander Pierce, standing beneath the chandelier light, like the calm center of a storm no one had expected, and Daniel Brooks felt the subtle shift in social gravity more clearly. With every passing second, as people who had been speaking with him only minutes earlier now allowed their conversations to drift away while their curiosity turned toward the pair across the room. The kind of quiet reorientation that happens in elite gatherings when influence rearranges itself without warning. And the gala host finished his welcome with enthusiastic gratitude before stepping aside, while several board members from the Skyline Aviation Foundation approached Alexander with polite handshakes and careful smiles, their voices respectful as they thanked him for his unexpected presence and expressed appreciation for the partnerships his aviation network had supported over the past decade. And Alexander acknowledged them with the calm confidence of someone who had attended thousands of such meetings, but who seemed far more attentive to Emily than to the formal greetings around him. And Daniel could see the subtle gestures now that he was watching closely, the quiet way Alexander slowed his pace to match Emily's steps, the instinctive awareness he showed when she shifted her weight slightly, as though making certain she remained comfortable amid the attention gathering around them. And it was the kind of small, respectful attentiveness that Daniel had once believed unnecessary in a world driven by ambition and speed. Yet seeing it now stirred an unexpected unease inside him, because it reminded him of the early years of his own marriage when Emily had still believed he would protect the life they were building together rather than leaving it behind in pursuit of something shinier and easier to display. And Vanessa Hart followed Daniel's gaze with growing curiosity before speaking quietly near his shoulder, asking who the man was that everyone seemed so eager to greet. And Daniel answered with careful restraint that it was Alexander Pierce, the founder of Pierce Global Fleet, whose private aviation infrastructure stretched across hundreds of airports, and whose company had reshaped international charter logistics over the past 15 years. Yet even as he spoke, the explanation felt incomplete, because the truth was that Pierce's influence reached far deeper than most people realized, shaping investment pipelines and aircraft supply chains that companies like Daniel's relied on to expand their own operations. And when Vanessa asked how Emily could possibly know someone like that, Daniel had no immediate answer, because the assumption he had carried for months was that Emily had quietly faded from the world he now occupied. Yet the scene unfolding across the ballroom contradicted that belief in ways that unsettled him more with each passing moment. And as Emily exchanged polite greetings with several foundation donors while Alexander remained beside her, Daniel noticed something else he had not expected. Emily was not nervous or defensive or seeking attention the way someone returning after a painful divorce might behave. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had already endured the hardest part of her journey long before stepping into this room tonight. And as the gala host announced that the evening's major investment presentation would begin shortly and invited guests to gather near the stage, Daniel Brooks felt the uncomfortable realization settling deeper inside his mind that the story he had confidently told about Emily Carter was no longer the story the room was beginning to see. Guests gradually moved closer to the stage as the host's announcement guided the evening toward its main presentation, the soft clinking of glasses and low conversation filling the ballroom once again. Yet the subtle gravity around Emily Carter and Alexander Pierce continued to shape the mood of the entire room. Because the presence of a man like Pierce had a way of quietly rewriting expectations without a single dramatic statement, and Daniel Brooks remained near the back of the growing crowd, with Vanessa Hart beside him while his attention stayed fixed on the two figures now standing only a short distance from the stage. Emily's emerald dress reflecting the warm chandelier light as she listened politely to a foundation board member explaining the evening's upcoming investment announcement. And Daniel noticed that people approached Alexander with a mixture of admiration and careful respect, the kind reserved for someone whose decisions could quietly influence billion-dollar industries. Yet Alexander never allowed the conversation to drift too far from Emily's comfort, occasionally lowering his voice so she could hear him clearly over the crowd, a small courtesy that seemed effortless but deliberate, and Daniel felt the strange weight of that detail more than he expected because it contrasted sharply with the way he himself had once moved through rooms like this with Emily at his side, always focused on the next opportunity, the next deal, the next handshake that might raise his status among men whose approval he once believed defined success. And Vanessa finally spoke again with quiet curiosity, asking whether Emily had known Alexander Pierce before tonight, and Daniel answered slowly that he did not know, though the calm familiarity between them suggested something far deeper than coincidence, and the uncertainty in his voice revealed a realization he had been resisting since the moment Emily stepped into the ballroom. Because if she truly had a connection to Alexander Pierce, then the assumptions Daniel had repeated for months about her fading quietly into an ordinary life were suddenly impossible to defend. And across the room, Emily shifted slightly as the host returned to the microphone to introduce the Foundation's future aviation expansion initiative, describing how the organization planned to develop a network of sustainable private airfields across the country, a project that would require both technological support and enormous financial backing. And as the presentation slides appeared on the large screen behind the stage, Daniel recognized the diagrams immediately because his own company had spent nearly a year preparing proposals to participate in that very expansion, proposals that depended heavily on access to aircraft fleets and logistics systems operated by Pierce Global Fleet. And the realization struck him with quiet force that the outcome of those negotiations could shape the future of his company for the next decade. Yet the man whose decision might influence that future was standing calmly beside the woman Daniel once dismissed as someone who could never belong in the world he had built. And as the host continued explaining the scale of the upcoming investment partnership, Emily turned her gaze briefly across the ballroom, where Daniel stood watching, her expression neither bitter nor triumphant, but simply thoughtful, as if she understood far more about the moment unfolding than he did. And in that quiet glance, Daniel Brooks felt the unsettling sense that the evening had only just begun, revealing how much the past he thought he had mastered was about to reshape his future. The presentation lights dimmed slightly as the large screen behind the stage shifted to the next slide, showing a sweeping map of the United States dotted with glowing blue markers representing the future network of private aviation hubs. And the host's confident voice carried easily across the ballroom, explaining how the Skyline Aviation Foundation planned to reshape regional travel for the next generation of aircraft, describing sustainable runways, advanced logistics centers, and partnerships with companies capable of managing fleets that could move executives from New York to Los Angeles in under 5 hours without relying on congested commercial routes. And Daniel Brooks listened carefully, because every word echoed conversations his own company had spent the past year preparing for. Yet tonight those plans suddenly felt less certain than they had only an hour earlier. Because the most important piece of the entire project stood quietly beside Emily Carter only a few yards away, and Daniel noticed the way Alexander Pierce watched the presentation not with excitement, but with calm evaluation, the measured attention of someone who had seen many ambitious proposals rise and fall, depending on the strength of the people behind them. And when the host finally mentioned that a major investment partner had recently agreed to support the project, the room leaned forward with anticipation, knowing the scale of funding required would likely come from only a handful of individuals capable of influencing the private aviation industry at that level. And although the host did not immediately say the name, the direction of every glance in the ballroom already pointed toward Alexander Pierce, because everyone present understood that no network of private airfields across the country could succeed without access to the aircraft fleets and infrastructure controlled by his company. And Emily stood quietly beside him during the announcement, her posture relaxed yet attentive, as if she had already heard every detail of the proposal before tonight. And Daniel felt the subtle unease returning to his chest, because the calm familiarity between them no longer looked like coincidence, but something deeper, something that suggested Emily had been part of conversations that Daniel himself had been trying to enter through formal proposals and endless meetings. And Vanessa leaned slightly closer to him again, whispering that the situation felt strange, as if Emily had somehow stepped into a world far beyond what anyone expected after the divorce. And Daniel could only nod faintly, because he was beginning to sense the truth that had been forming slowly since the moment Emily walked into the ballroom. The truth that the past he believed he had outgrown might still hold influence over the future he was trying to secure. And as the presentation concluded with applause, the host invited Alexander Pierce to join him briefly on stage to say a few words about the importance of long-term investment in aviation innovation. And when Alexander finally stepped forward, leaving Emily standing calmly near the front of the crowd, Daniel watched closely, because the entire room now understood that the next few minutes could shape the direction of the project his company depended on. Yet, even as Alexander approached the stage, he turned slightly back toward Emily, offering her a small, reassuring smile that suggested the evening held meaning far beyond business announcements. And Daniel Brooks felt the uncomfortable realization settling deeper within him that whatever connection existed between Emily Carter and Alexander Pierce was about to become impossible for anyone in the ballroom to ignore. Alexander Pierce stepped onto the stage with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions quietly reshaped industries. And the applause that followed his arrival was respectful, but measured, because everyone present understood they were now listening to someone whose words carried far more weight than the presentation slides still glowing behind him. And as the room settled into attentive silence, he adjusted the microphone slightly and thanked the Skyline Aviation Foundation for their work supporting innovation in private aviation across the United States, speaking in a steady voice that carried easily across the ballroom without any need for dramatic emphasis, explaining that the future of aviation was not simply about faster aircraft or larger fleets, but about building systems that connected opportunity with responsibility, systems that allowed businesses and communities to move efficiently while reducing environmental impact and expanding access to regions often overlooked by traditional infrastructure. And Daniel Brooks listened carefully with the rest of the audience, yet his attention drifted repeatedly toward Emily Carter, standing near the front of the crowd, because the quiet composure she carried seemed completely natural beside the influence Alexander now commanded from the stage. And it unsettled Daniel more than he expected, because Emily had once stood beside him during similar speeches years ago, offering quiet encouragement while he chased opportunities that never seemed large enough to satisfy his ambition. And now the roles in the room had shifted in a way he had never imagined. And Alexander continued speaking about the importance of partnership, explaining that projects of this scale required more than money or aircraft. They required people who understood resilience, patience, and the courage to rebuild when plans did not unfold the way the world expected. And as he spoke those words, his gaze moved briefly toward Emily in the crowd, with a look of quiet respect that several people nearby noticed, even if they did not fully understand its meaning. And Daniel felt the moment land like a quiet echo of conversations he had once dismissed, when Emily tried to remind him that success meant more than appearances and quick victories. And Vanessa Hart followed Daniel's line of sight again, noticing the connection in Alexander's glance, before asking softly whether Emily had somehow helped build the partnership being announced tonight. And Daniel did not answer immediately, because the idea felt both impossible and increasingly undeniable as the speech continued. And when Alexander finished by explaining that Pierce Global Fleet had committed major logistical support to the project, the room responded with enthusiastic applause, because everyone understood the significance of that commitment for the future of the Foundation's expansion. Yet before stepping away from the microphone, Alexander added one final remark that shifted the mood of the evening in a way no one had expected. He said that every great partnership begins with someone brave enough to start again after the world assumes their story is finished. And although he did not mention a name, his eyes once again found Emily Carter standing quietly among the guests. And in that moment, Daniel Brooks realized with growing certainty that the quiet return of his former wife to this ballroom was not an accident, but the beginning of a story the entire room was only starting to understand. The applause following Alexander Pierce's final words lingered longer than anyone expected, not because the speech had been dramatic, but because the quiet message behind it settled into the room, like a realization slowly taking shape in every corner of the ballroom. And as Alexander stepped down from the stage, the host thanked him again, while guests began speaking excitedly about the scale of the new aviation partnership that had just been announced. Yet Daniel Brooks barely heard the conversations around him, because his attention remained fixed on Emily Carter, standing calmly near the front of the gathering, her emerald dress glowing softly beneath the chandelier light, while several Foundation members now approached her with polite smiles and respectful curiosity. And Daniel felt the strange sensation of watching a story unfold that he no longer controlled, because only a year earlier Emily had walked out of the life he believed defined success, leaving behind the world of high-profile deals and ambitious presentations he had built around himself. And now she stood comfortably inside that same world again, but beside a man whose influence extended far beyond anything Daniel had yet achieved. And Vanessa Hart shifted slightly beside him, asking whether he planned to go speak with Emily now that the presentation had ended. And the question lingered in the air longer than Daniel expected, because the answer felt more complicated than it should have been. And across the ballroom, Alexander returned to Emily's side with the same calm familiarity he had shown all evening, speaking quietly to her while the surrounding guests gave them respectful space. And Daniel noticed how easily Emily smiled during the conversation, as though the attention surrounding them did not weigh on her the way public scrutiny once had. And that small detail unsettled him more than any of the investment announcements, because it revealed something he had not expected. Emily Carter no longer looked like someone returning to prove a point or seek approval. She looked like someone who had already built a new life beyond the expectations of the people who once doubted her. And as Daniel considered whether to approach them, the gala host announced that the evening would now transition into the networking reception portion of the event, where investors and partners could discuss future collaboration opportunities. And immediately the ballroom filled with the quiet movement of guests circulating towards small conversation groups. Yet Daniel remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching as Emily and Alexander began walking slowly across the room together, several aviation executives greeting Alexander along the way, while Emily listened attentively beside him. And one of the executives Daniel recognized from previous negotiations shook Alexander's hand warmly before turning to Emily, with clear respect, introducing himself and thanking her for the insights she had apparently shared during earlier planning discussions. And the brief exchange struck Daniel with quiet force, because it revealed something he had not known until that exact moment. Emily had not simply returned tonight as Alexander's guest. She had been involved in the conversations shaping the very aviation project Daniel's company had been pursuing for months. And as the realization settled deeper, Daniel Brooks understood that the past he believed he had closed behind him had quietly continued moving forward without him. And now it stood only a few yards away, inside the same room where he once believed his future was guaranteed. The ballroom had shifted into the quieter rhythm of strategic conversations as investors and executives moved between small clusters of discussion, the warm glow of chandelier light reflecting off polished marble and crystal glasses, while the distant skyline of Manhattan shimmered beyond the tall windows. And Daniel Brooks finally realized that standing still would not make the moment disappear, because Emily Carter and Alexander Pierce were now speaking with several aviation executives whose companies Daniel had spent months trying to impress. And every instinct built through years of competitive ambition told him that if he did not step forward soon, he would become invisible in a conversation that might determine the future of his company. So he straightened his jacket and began walking slowly across the ballroom, with Vanessa Hart following beside him. The sound of their footsteps nearly lost beneath the quiet hum of conversation and soft jazz drifting once again from the trio. Near the stage, and as Daniel approached, he heard fragments of the discussion unfolding between Alexander, Emily, and the executives. Technical phrases about fleet logistics, runway expansion, and sustainable aviation fuel that revealed the level of detail already being explored among the group. And when Daniel finally reached them, one of the executives noticed him first, offering a polite greeting, because Daniel's company had submitted proposals during earlier planning phases of the project, and the brief acknowledgement allowed Daniel to step naturally into the circle, though the atmosphere immediately felt different from the confident networking exchanges he was accustomed to leading, because here he was not the center of attention, but simply another participant observing the connection between Emily Carter and Alexander Pierce that had quietly reshaped the evening. And Emily turned toward him, then her expression composed and calm, as though this encounter had always been expected, rather than avoided. And for a brief second, Daniel saw the familiar woman he once knew reflected in her eyes. Yet there was also something stronger there now, something steady and self-assured that had not existed during the final months of their marriage. And Daniel spoke, carefully greeting Alexander first with professional respect before acknowledging Emily with a quiet hello that carried far more history than the simple words suggested. And Alexander responded politely, extending his hand with the measured courtesy of someone accustomed to meeting executives whose companies relied on the same aviation infrastructure his firm controlled, while Emily offered Daniel a calm nod that neither invited confrontation nor avoided recognition of the past they shared. And the surrounding executives continued their discussion about the upcoming aviation hub project, mentioning logistical partnerships and regional investment opportunities, and one of them casually referenced the strategic insights Emily had contributed during earlier advisory meetings that helped shape the proposed network routes. And Daniel felt that sentence settle heavily in his mind, because it confirmed what he had only begun to suspect moments earlier, that Emily had not merely returned tonight as Alexander's companion, but had been directly involved in conversations shaping the same aviation expansion Daniel had been pursuing from the outside for months. And as the group continued speaking, Daniel Brooks understood with growing clarity that the story he once told about Emily Carter had quietly transformed into something far more complex than the simple narrative he had repeated to colleagues for the past year. And standing there beneath the warm chandelier light, with the future of his company potentially linked to decisions unfolding in front of him, he realized the most unexpected truth of the evening was that Emily Carter had never truly left the world he believed he owned. She had simply found a different way to rise within it. Daniel Brooks remained within the small circle of executives as the conversation continued shifting between technical aviation topics and future investment strategy. Yet the balance of the discussion had subtly changed since he arrived, because the attention that once naturally gravitated toward him during industry gatherings now flowed more easily toward Alexander Pierce and the quiet insight Emily Carter offered beside him. And Daniel noticed the way several aviation consultants asked Emily follow-up questions about the regional hub network while referencing ideas she had apparently suggested during earlier planning meetings, ideas involving flight corridor efficiency and sustainable infrastructure that had impressed the Foundation's advisory board months before tonight's announcement. And hearing those details unsettled Daniel more than he expected, because he realized Emily had been participating in the same strategic discussions he had been trying to access through formal proposals and networking calls. Yet she had reached those rooms through a path he never considered possible. And Vanessa Hart stood quietly beside him, observing the exchange with growing curiosity, because the version of Emily Daniel once described to her had sounded timid and uncertain. Yet the woman standing here now spoke with thoughtful clarity when asked about long-term aviation development and regional investment opportunities. And when Emily finished explaining how smaller aviation hubs could connect underserved cities across the Midwest without overwhelming existing commercial airports, several executives nodded with clear interest, one of them mentioning that her analysis had been included in the Foundation's internal report earlier that year. And Daniel felt the subtle shift of respect within the group because the executives were no longer speaking to Emily simply as Alexander Pierce's companion, but as someone whose ideas had already influenced the direction of the project they were discussing tonight, and Alexander listened quietly during most of the exchange, occasionally adding brief remarks that supported her explanations rather than overshadowing them, a pattern that revealed the depth of professional respect between them. And Daniel found himself studying that dynamic carefully because it reflected something he had not recognized during his marriage to Emily. The quiet strength she possessed when given the space to develop her own ideas rather than standing in the shadow of someone else's ambition. And eventually, one of the executives turned toward Daniel asking about his company's current logistics capabilities since they had submitted proposals earlier in the year. And Daniel responded professionally, outlining the fleet management services his firm could provide for the upcoming aviation network while maintaining the calm tone expected in these conversations. Yet beneath the confident explanation, he could not ignore the deeper awareness forming in his mind that the future of those proposals might depend less on his presentation tonight and more on the partnership between Alexander Pierce and the woman standing calmly beside him. And as the conversation gradually expanded to include additional guests joining the circle, Daniel noticed Emily glance briefly toward the large windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, where the city lights reflected across the glass like distant constellations. And for a moment her thoughtful expression suggested she was reflecting on how far the journey had taken her since the night she walked away from the life Daniel believed defined success. And standing there within the elegant ballroom filled with investors and aviation leaders, Daniel Brooks understood that the evening had quietly reached a turning point where past assumptions no longer held power over the future unfolding before him. The conversation among the executives gradually loosened as the networking reception continued, yet the subtle center of gravity in the room still circled around Alexander Pierce and Emily Carter. Because the aviation project that had just been announced represented one of the most ambitious private infrastructure expansions in the country, and everyone present understood that the decisions made in the coming months would shape the industry for years, and Daniel Brooks remained within the group longer than he expected, listening carefully as additional guests joined the discussion, each greeting Alexander with the respectful familiarity reserved for a man whose business decisions could redirect entire markets, while Emily continued contributing thoughtful observations about the regional aviation model the Foundation hoped to develop. Her tone measured and analytical as she spoke about passenger accessibility in cities where commercial airports were already operating near capacity, and several executives nodded in agreement with the perspective she offered because it aligned with the strategic planning reports circulating among aviation investors earlier that year. And Daniel realized with growing clarity that Emily's involvement had not been symbolic or accidental, but the result of months of careful participation in conversations that he had never known were happening. And the awareness settled heavily within him because it forced him to reconsider the quiet assumptions he had carried since their divorce. The belief that Emily had stepped away from the world he was building while he continued advancing through it alone. Yet standing here now he could see that the opposite had quietly taken place. She had continued forward along a path that no longer depended on him at all. And Vanessa's heart shifted beside him again, glancing between Emily and Alexander with open curiosity before whispering that the two of them seemed less like business partners and more like people who genuinely respected each other's ideas. And Daniel felt the truth in that observation, even if he did not respond immediately, because the dynamic between them revealed something that had been missing from his own relationship with Emily long before their marriage ended. The simple recognition of her voice as something worth hearing rather than something expected to remain quietly supportive in the background. And eventually the conversation drifted toward other aspects of the aviation hub proposal as additional investors asked about funding phases and regional logistics partnerships, giving Daniel a natural moment to step slightly back from the group. And as he did, Emily turned toward him, once more offering a brief calm smile that held neither bitterness nor triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement of the shared history they both understood without needing to speak about it in front of the room. And Daniel returned the nod slowly before allowing the surrounding conversations to carry him toward another cluster of executives discussing potential charter fleet expansion. Yet even as he joined the new discussion, he found his attention drifting back toward the center of the ballroom, where Emily Carter now stood speaking confidently among leaders of the same industry he had once believed belonged entirely to him. And in that quiet realization, Daniel Brooks understood that the evening had revealed a truth more powerful than any presentation or negotiation. The life he once imagined for himself had continued, moving forward. But Emily Carter had moved forward as well, and the path she had chosen had brought her to a place he had never expected to see her again. The reception continued beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers as conversations drifted between investment strategy and aviation technology. Yet a quieter moment unfolded near the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, when Emily Carter stepped slightly away from the center of the ballroom to rest for a moment. The reflections of city lights stretching across the glass like distant constellations, while the soft hum of conversation carried behind her, and Alexander Pierce joined her a few seconds later with the same calm presence he had maintained all evening, offering a glass of sparkling water before standing beside her in comfortable silence, the kind that existed between people who understood each other without needing constant words. And Emily thanked him quietly before glancing back toward the crowd where the executives continued discussing the new aviation hub project, explaining that seeing the proposal finally announced tonight still felt slightly unreal after months of planning meetings and research sessions that had taken place far from the spotlight of events like this one. And Alexander nodded with quiet approval, saying that the strongest ideas often grew in quiet rooms long before anyone noticed their impact. And Emily allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile, because the past year had been exactly that kind of journey for her, one that began with uncertainty and long nights rebuilding her confidence after walking away from a life that no longer felt honest. And she spoke softly about the early days when she had first met Alexander during a regional aviation conference where she had been attending a workshop on transportation infrastructure simply because she wanted to understand how industries evolved beyond the surface-level headlines. And Alexander remembered that moment clearly because Emily had approached him after his keynote presentation with questions that most investors never thought to ask, questions about how smaller cities could benefit from private aviation networks, and how infrastructure decisions could shape opportunity across entire regions. And he admitted that her curiosity and determination had impressed him long before they ever discussed working together on the Foundation's project. And Emily looked back across the ballroom, where Daniel Brooks stood speaking with another group of executives, and for a moment her expression softened with the recognition of how far life had carried both of them since their marriage ended, not with anger, but with the quiet understanding that some chapters simply end so new ones can begin. And Alexander followed her gaze briefly before returning his attention to the skyline outside the window, saying that the aviation network they were building would connect more than cities, it would connect people who believed in second chances and long-term vision. And Emily rested a hand gently over the small curve of her pregnancy, listening to the distant music and the conversations filling the ballroom. And in that quiet moment, she realized that everything she had once feared losing had quietly transformed into something stronger than she ever imagined, because the world she had stepped away from had not vanished without her. It had simply opened new doors that led her somewhere better.